with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, March 30th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Matthew Connolly, author of the Declassification Engine, What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets. And later in the show, Orly Noy, on whether or not the Israeli protesters really want true democracy. Meanwhile, the Senate votes to repeal both the 91 and 2002 Iraq military authorizations. 18 Republicans joined, but I'm skeptical that Kevin McCarthy will bring it up in the House. Netanyahu responds to Biden's criticism of his judicial overhaul desires. Well, maybe we'll just take our money back. How about that? Fund your own military, bro. The U.S.'s largest egg producer reported an over 700% profit increase last quarter. Another example of rampant corporate gouging at the root of inflation. The grand jury overseeing Trump's case in New York will break for a month, meaning any indictment won't come before late April. Matt's not back, though, yet. Not sure. Yeah. Interesting. Rolling Stone reports that Trump is working on crafting a campaign platform surrounding illegal military strikes in Mexico. Donald the Dove, said Maureen Dowd in 2016. A Bush-appointed federal judge in Texas has blocked the ACA's mandate that health insurers cover preventative care, including cancer screenings and notably PrEP, which helps prophylactically combat HIV. The reasonings were explicitly homophobic, and the group backing the plaintiffs is a Stephen Miller group. The Biden administration opened bidding on drilling in the Gulf of Mexico yesterday. Turkey is set to approve Finland's NATO membership today. 9 New York members of Congress, including Jamal Bowman and AOC, have signed a letter pressing Hochul to support the climate bill going through New York State's government. It was crafted by many of the left-leaning members in New York State. Heavily right-wing Kentucky legislature votes to override Democratic Governor Andy Beshear's veto of an anti-trans bill. This also comes as West Virginia passes a bill banning gender-affirming care for minors. And lastly, Ron DeSantis signs into law a huge school voucher expansion. Privatization is the goal of all of these attacks on our schools. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's an EmMajority Report Thursday. Welcome. Another Matt writes in, it would be amazing if Matt is on the Gwyneth Paltrow case. Matt's sitting on the grand jury to determine who skied into who, and who lost a full day of skiing and who did not.
I talked to him yesterday for a sec over the phone. I was hoping he was going to be like, yeah, you know, I'm getting they were flying me to Park City, Utah for some reason. Not sure why, but can't really say much else.
Yeah, right. Can't give you the specifics of the case, but for some reason, I'm desperately needed out west. That would be hilarious. Good I am, another Matt. Well, I just also want to note that thing about DeSantis there. I mean, all of these attacks on education, whether they be kind of secondary or not necessarily front-facing, I mean, you have to realize that these attacks on public education from the right, from DeSantis's book bans and the general anti-critical race theory panic, the anti-trans panic, the grooming panic, the refusal to do anything about guns, school shootings, the critique of teachers' unions, the relentless attack on them, particularly with COVID. It all boils down to a desire to privatize our public school system, and to undercut it as an institution. And so the school voucher program in Florida, that's a natural progression of that. But let's turn now to the hearings yesterday, which I know Sam gleefully covered, and I'm going to bring a little bit more of a frustrating element to it because this clip is of Mitt Romney. But Howard Schultz just completely filleted, incredibly so, in front of the Senate committee yesterday, because Bernie Sanders, it's the labor committee, right? I mean, he heads that
the health
committee.
Committee, which is health education, labor, pensions.
Right,
yeah.
right. So that's quite convenient, and it's helpful that Bernie Sanders is such a long tenured member of the Senate that we can have him to head that kind of committee and get Howard Schultz to be dragged in front of the public and answer for his union busting. But some people, like Mitt Romney, don't want him to answer for his union busting. In fact, Mitt Romney really thinks that there's nothing wrong with what Howard Schultz has done because he's a, quote, job creator. This was the prelude to what Mitt Romney had to say in the midst of during that hearing.
I defer to Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Cassidy. I recognize at the outset there's some irony to a non-coffee drinking Mormon conservative defending a Democrat candidate for president in perhaps one of the most liberal companies in America. That being said, I also think it's somewhat rich that that you're being grilled by people who have never had the opportunity to create a single job, and yet they believe that they know better how to do so, and what's best for the American worker, and what's best for the American economy, what's best for growth. I also think it's rich to not recognize the extraordinary conflict of interest we have, which is our Democrat colleagues overwhelmingly get their campaign funds from unions, and therefore would like to find every possible way to extend unions, even if an enterprise feels that it's in their best interest to pursue a different course. Now, I know that there are a number of reasons.
Can you pause it for a sec? It's hilarious that he does not extend that same analysis to his Republican colleagues who get corporate donations, wealthy donations, many of which we don't even know about because we don't have any transparency laws on purpose in this country, from corporations, from the wealthy. That entire party is buoyed by corporate money, and that pales in comparison to union political donations. No, the Democratic Party is reluctantly beginning to welcome workers back into the party after expelling them for years and decades under a neoliberal consensus because there was just like the Reaganification of politics and the desire to appeal to those very campaign donors that exclusively fund the Republican Party. Now we're just beginning to crack the door open for unions to have at least a little bit more power in this country. It's laughable for him to even put it in the same universe as the corporate donations that the entire Republican Party lives on, and the Democratic Party also continues to unfortunately live on. But continue.
Like to find every possible way to extend unions, even if an enterprise feels that it's in their best interest to pursue a different course. Now, I know that there are a number of reasons why you might wish not to have union organization in your various enterprises. At the same time, I agree with Senator Cassidy and with your own comments, Mr. Schultz, which is that people have a legal right to form a union. There are some employers that are not good employers, and a union is necessary to protect the rights of those individuals, and that if any enterprise, including yours, has broken the law, that it should be held accountable for having done so. the same time, there are legitimate reasons why an enterprise might choose not to become unionized. I first would note that within your company, there are probably some stores that are union, some that are non-union. Do the non-union store employees get paid less than the union store employees?
The starting wage has been the same. The only difference is the benefits that we created in May. And my understanding under the law is that we were not allowed to provide those benefits to people who are organizing to join a union.
Yeah, that is a lie to a degree. Howard Schultz and Starbucks ended up proposing these kinds of benefits as a way to undercut mass unionization efforts across the country, because the appeal that the unions had to the workers was much more lucrative and better, and they were trying to give people carrots essentially to ensure that they didn't join a union. But you would have been much better off joining the union long term. There's so much there, but one of the most liberal companies in America, Howard Schultz describes it as. It's based on this old notion because Bill Clinton had Howard Schultz at the White House. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, allergies, something like that. Howard Schultz at the White House. There was kind of like a liberal veneer branding about corporate responsibility that Starbucks really embodied that just is completely outdated in our current context and doesn't hold a lot of water. When he talked about job creators, bosses, billionaires like Howard Schultz, multi-millionaires like Mitt Romney, they're not social workers, they're not teachers, they're not firefighters, they're not public servants, they're not even politicians. They're not there to maintain a societal good. The only reason they employ people is to enrich themselves. They attempt to limit employment to the point where there is as little as redundancy as possible, specifically in our current corporate climate, meaning as little as of employment as possible. As lean of a labor model. I mean, we just saw that biting Norfolk Southern in the ass when it came to the train derailment. From their perspective, that's the cost of doing business. But they want to have as little workers as possible, create as few jobs as possible so they can squeeze as many profits out of their company as they can. They don't have a duty to their employees. The duty that these bosses have are to their shareholders. It's their fiduciary duty by law for them to maximize shareholder value, not to create as many jobs as possible. Let's be clear about that. They have a mandate, and it's not to workers, it is to shareholders. And eventually, to themselves, because a lot of them own shares. Stock buybacks, that kind of thing. They're not job creators. They're job gatekeepers. And oftentimes, in Mitt Romney's case in particular as well, they're job killers. Old article from 2011 by Michael Barbaro from the New York Times, now the Daily guy, wrote about Mitt Romney in the midst of his presidential campaign. By the green-hued yardsticks of Wall Street, the 1990s buyout of an Illinois medical company by Mitt Romney's private equity firm was a spectacular success. Mr. Romney's company, Bain Capital, sent a team of 10 turnaround experts from Boston to ferret out waste, motivate executives, and study untapped markets. By the time the Harvard MBAs from Bain were finished, sales at the medical company Dade International had more than doubled. The business acquired two of its rivals, and Mr. Romney's firm collected $242 million, a return 8 times its investment. Whoa, that's a lot of job creation, right? But an examination of the Dade deal, which Mr. Romney approved and presided over, shows the unintended human costs, Barbaro, let's not, unintended, human costs and messy financial consequences behind the brand of capitalism that he practiced for 15 years. At Bain Capital's direction, Dade quadrupled the money it owed creditors and vendors. It took steps that propelled the business towards bankruptcy. And in waves of layoffs, it cut loose 1,700 workers in the United States, including Brian and Kristen Shoemaker, who lost their jobs at the plant in Westwood, Massachusetts. Staggered, Mr. Shoemaker wondered, how could the bean counters just come in here and say, hey, it's over? They interview some of the workers that lost their jobs. Bain and a small group of investors bought Dade in 1994 with mostly borrowed money, limiting their risk. They extracted cash from the company at almost every turn, paying themselves nearly $100 million in fees. First for buying the company, and then for helping to run it. Later, just after Mr. Romney stepped down from his role, Bain took $242 million out of the business in a transaction that, according to bankruptcy documents and several former Dade officials, weakened the company. Even some people who benefited from the payday and found it reasonable at the time now question it. Essentially, they pushed the company into that bankruptcy. On the campaign trail, Mitt Romney has taken a tough love approach to the economy, suggesting that the best remedy for the housing market was to allow foreclosures to hit the bottom. It was the same approach he took with Bain, as he explained in an interview to the New York Times in 2007 when asked about layoffs at the companies that he bought. Sometimes the medicine is a little bitter, he said, but it is necessary to save the life of a patient. The patient being Bain and all the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're making from this. And it goes on and on. I mean, Bain ended up helping this company, Dade, acquire a company called DuPont, part of a division in DuPont, a diagnostics division in 1996, and another medical testing company. For DuPont, they had a plant in Puerto Rico after Dade, under the direction of Bain Capital, acquired DuPont. It closed its plant in Puerto Rico. All but a few of its nearly 300 workers were laid off. Arsenio Munez Rosado, a 51-year-old father who has spent 23 years at the plant, started out as a groundskeeper, sank into a debilitating depression. Still jobless 6 months after he was let go, he tried to commit suicide with a full bottle of Xanax pills. It was the first of several attempts. Job creators. Hilarious. Hilarious that these guys probably have some semblance of internalized guilt. I mean, a lot of them are sociopaths. I totally understand that, but they still at least know how they come off. So they have to rebrand being a capitalist. We're a job creator. We're a job creator, baby. In reality, they're job killers. They're job slashers. They are layoff kings that enrich themselves on the backs of workers and then pretend they're being benevolent. They're not necessary for society. If we cared about job creation, we would have a jobs guarantee. We would have a federal jobs guarantee where there wasn't a profit motive to keep people employed. The only reason they create jobs to the minimal amount that they have to, is so that they can get rich. When it gets in the way of their profits, they cut jobs. And Mitt Romney is exactly the exact kind of person that embodies that mindset. And this is exactly what the Republican Party is and always has been. Laundering lies for the most powerful in the world, getting rich off of people and workers, and then branding themselves as pro-worker and aesthetic. But Mitt Romney, Mr. Car Elevator, can't even do that. Hilarious. I hope him and Howard Schultz had a drink after that. Brothers in arms. All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to be joined by Matthew Connolly. Back, and we are joined now by Matthew Connolly, professor of international and global history at Columbia University, principal investigator at History Lab, and author of the book the Declassification Engine, What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Emma.
Of course. So classified documents, they've been in the news a lot lately, that phrase, given Donald Trump's propensity to hoard them for God knows what reason, and then even more problematically, refusing to return them. But we also then learn, okay, Biden has some laying around. So does Mike Pence. And it begs the question, right? How many damn documents are classified and why?
Well, the short answer is nobody knows. There's an office in the government that you've probably never heard of. Their job is to tell the rest of us, how many times officials are classifying information. But 5 years ago, they gave up and they said they can no longer even guesstimate, how many times every year officials are classifying this or that record. But the last time they tried, it was over 50 million times a year. So yeah, there's just tons of this stuff lying all over the place.
And it just seems like there's very little oversight in that process. What classifies as a classified document, what doesn't? I mean, like, how much of this is essentially, in your opinion, just a best practice for government officials to get away with whatever they want to get away with? And it's become so widespread that there isn't even a thought associated with classifying anything anymore.
Yeah, well, there are rules. These are the rules that presidents issue. They issue executive orders. And according to these rules, they're supposed to only classify information when it can otherwise endanger national security. But as you can well imagine, when they're doing this like tens of millions of times every year, and when there are literally millions of people who have security clearances, you can imagine that all kinds of people are classifying information for their own secret reasons. But, the thing that really bothers me, about, when Trump walked off with boxes and boxes of these documents, it's really about not so much national security, it's about democratic accountability. Because the whole point of preserving those kinds of materials and making sure they're kept in the National Archives so that the rest of us eventually get to see them is so that we can hold our leaders to account. So if they're walking off with these records or destroying them, it means that even the court of history is closed.
Yeah. And from your perspective, I know that you've been working really hard to get some more sunlight on these kinds of things. I mean, just from a researching perspective, what has that process been like, trying to, through FOIA requests and other means, get a handle on just the scope of these classified documents?
Yeah, so what my colleagues and I have been doing at Columbia is that we've been trying to aggregate, the millions of documents that have been declassified, and then we're using data science tools to figure out what's missing. And so, when, at some point in the future, one would hope you could begin looking back, at what documents have been preserved, say, from the Trump years, you can begin to see, what's missing, right? Because sometimes, like, the missing documents, they leave suspicious patterns. And so, the book I wrote, The Declassification Engine, you can see, for example, during the time that Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, there are periods, like whole weeks, where almost no diplomatic cables are accessible. Almost none of them have been preserved. And the people at the National Archives will tell you that they never got an explanation from the State Department as to why that part of our national history is just gone.
I want to get to that period of history for sure, because World War II and then the Cold War is really, as you write, when this seismic shift begins to happen. But let's just back up really to the creation of the United States Constitutional Convention. Like, what were the systems or lack thereof? What was the collective mindset, if there was any, about classification and secrecy at the founding of the country? And you write about guys like Jefferson and Jackson as well.
Yeah. So, if you read the Constitution, you find that there's actually only one place where they explicitly allow for our government keeping information from us. And interestingly, it's not the executive branch. It's really only Congress, in the Constitution, that has a recognized authority, to at least keep some of its deliberations secret. But at the same time, in the Federalist Papers, some of the people you just mentioned, people like Hamilton, Madison, and so on, they also said that the president was going to have to at sometimes act with secrecy and dispatch, right? And I think most Americans, flash forward a couple hundred years, we would recognize that there are things, whether they're about international negotiations or secret military technology, there are times and places when it's important that our elected leaders do have the power, to keep at least some information for some time, secret from us and especially from our enemies. But what's happened in the meantime is that, this complex that began in the Second World War, it just grew and grew to the point where it's grown completely out of control, to the point where even presidents can no longer keep it under wraps.
Right. And I mean, talk a bit about the how when secrets were kept earlier on, it was more related to keeping information out of the hands of essentially non-white men. Like you talk about how in particular this related to the treatment of indigenous Americans or Black Americans early on in our country's history.
Yeah, so for the first 150 years of our history, the U.S. was really an outlier. We didn't have a central intelligence agency. We didn't have like a black chamber to intercept communications and decode them, as like every other even middling power did at the time. And so, in that way, the U.S. was an outlier and actually at the forefront, right, in advancing principles of democratic government and accountability. But of course, as we also know, at the time, for much of this time, the only people who really were free of state surveillance were white male property owners, and others, especially Black people and women too, were often excluded, even from learning how to read, even having the rudiments, to know what the government was doing. And without that, of course, you can't keep anyone accountable. And so, part of the story, of America, I would say, is that over this period of time, gradually, the scope of who, counted as citizens and had equal, liberties to hold their leaders to account, that gradually expanded over time. But when you get to, the point in World War II, when this new thing, at least new in American history, this apparatus, for keeping a growing amount of information from the American people, when you look at like who it was who first created this system and how they policed its boundaries, what you find is it was basically white men who protected, this last part of our government and made certain that it was very difficult for anybody who wasn't like them, to get access to it. And the way they did that was through things like security clearances and deciding who had a need to know, top secrets about our government.
Yeah, it's a gradual kind of building up of like certain gatekeeping elements that now we've just completely naturalized. But when it gets starts to go on steroids, I guess, is, as you write, during World War II, when transparency really kind of became a bygone era, particularly for the federal government.
Yeah, and in the years that followed, some people now I think might be surprised, like gender non-conforming people, large numbers of them were able to work in the federal government. Many of them had responsible positions, like in the State Department, for example. And actually, it was after World War II that these people were systematically like hunted down and fired. Right. I mean, so there was actually a crackdown where even the limited diversity that was possible at that time was greatly narrowed. Now, right up to the present day, it's notorious, that the national security state, when we're talking, for example, about the Pentagon or our 18 different intelligence agencies, it's notorious that, especially at the most senior level, these are the least diverse parts of our government. And it's still the case, that when trying to get security clearances, even to be qualified to do the kind of work, the secret work that they do, things like a bad credit rating, any kind of history of an arrest, any admission, of using illicit drugs.
Smoking pot, you still can't get a security clearance. It's ridiculous.
There are all kinds of like structural reasons why, large parts of the American society is more or less excluded.
Yeah.
Even participating in working in national security.
Yeah, that was one of my sweet mom's reaction when I got arrested for smoking weed this one time. She's like, "You can't work in the government now." I'm like, "I don't know if I wanted to." So there's that. There's that.
The CIA may not be right for you, Emma.
I don't think so. But it just like that is so interesting too, especially given like this right-wing campaign right now to say that wokeness is invading the CIA, which is just hilarious. It's a PR exercise for them to bring more kinds of people in because it's important for these institutions to evolve with changing times so that they can maintain the equilibrium that allows them to say classify everything all the time.
Yeah, that's the complaint. You actually have people who have been at the CIA for decades, like publicly, writing articles saying that, wokeness is taking over the CIA and it's making it impossible for us to do our mission. But what you find, like as I did, my colleague and I, Pat Irvin, we've been doing research. We're going to be writing up a report what we found in interviewing people, who have worked in government, in many cases, Black people, women, et cetera, to talk about their experiences. And what they'll say is that, political correctness, DEI sessions, like do nothing for them, right? What really matters in terms of whether, the intelligence community or the Pentagon at its leadership ranks, whether it resembles the rest of America, what matters, of course, is whether people have opportunities to advance, like whether they get mentored and supported. But unfortunately, like when you go back and you look at how, all this began, and the fact that no one like that ever had an opportunity when we're talking about the 1950s and 60s and 70s, there's a path dependence, that plays out over decades, where the people hired then who are in senior positions now, they came of age at a time in which, these, for example, the FBI didn't have a single woman agent.
Yeah.
Not one Black person was allowed to be an FBI agent. Only the people who were J. Edgar Hoover's personal servants, qualified as agents if you were
and
Black.
Eventually informants, right? I mean, and eventually informants for that purpose. Only when they became useful to infiltrating civil rights groups, then and then we can have some Black people in our institution.
And the FBI, these are the gatekeepers of the national security state. Like typically, if you want to get a security clearance, these are the people who are going to interview you, your friends, your relatives, your employers, et cetera. So just think what that means. In the FBI, that kind of institutional culture is what's guarding the gates and deciding who gets to make national security policy in the U.S.
Right. Well, then let's turn to the Cold War, because that is, of course, when you can trace a lot of the systemic issues with our national security state to, and where the complete, I would call it institutional opacity. I don't even never know how to. Yeah, sure. Where that becomes like incredibly institutional. You kind of trace this back to the Manhattan Project in particular. Take us through that period of history when secrecy becomes so congealed in the federal government.
Yeah, so the Manhattan Project, it was like the prototype, of what a special access program would be. And, now we have thousands of these. Even the government can't even tell us like how many special access programs there are. But the Manhattan Project was the first of its kind. And what that means basically is that the fact itself, the fact the United States was developing atomic weapons was classified as top secret. And the only people allowed to know that, were people who were said to have a need to know. That didn't include, for example, the Vice President of the United States, like Harry Truman himself, wasn't allowed to know about the atomic bomb project until Roosevelt died and he became president. And so, the Manhattan Project like took things to new extremes, but it also like developed a whole system where you have like levels of secrecy, top secret, secret, confidential, and so on. And you also had these silos, these special access programs where even people with top secret clearances wouldn't necessarily be allowed to know what was happening in these other programs. So this is in part, a Cold War story. It's one that begins during the Second World War, begins at Pearl Harbor, I would say. But it's not only about the Cold War. Because when you actually look back and you get access, for example, to like top secret war plans, what you find is that in the 1960s, the Pentagon was running wargaming scenarios where they were imagining race war in the United States, right? So it wasn't only about the Soviet Union. Like they had all kinds of anxieties that they played out in these top secret wargaming scenario exercises, right? So there's a lot of history here that still is incredibly relevant, to some of the things we're confronting today.
Well, I mean, they also the national security state attempted to make that connection by like some of these civil rights groups. Hey, they may be communists, in the subversives in the U.S. And then that just explodes everything, of course. And I'm not sure. There's so much we don't know, so I might ask you to speculate a little here. Mm-hmm. But we've talked on this program about the JFK assassination many times. There are new questions, thankfully, I think, being brought about the Martin Luther King assassination and what authorities did or did not know, what their involvement was or was not. Mm-hmm. Like this entire period of the assassination of political leaders and civil rights leaders, it cannot be a coincidence that this is also a time where the national security state it's feeling itself and knows we are the ultimate secret organization on the planet. And we still don't have the information that we need to actually cover that history accurately.
Yeah. I think, there are some who will never be satisfied, with the official explanations, whether it's about the MLK assassination or John F. Kennedy. And with good reason, because unfortunately, like for far too long, all too much of that history was covered up. And once we learn more, we find out, that in fact, the Pentagon, intelligence community, the CIA, they did undertake programs, right, where they were training people to become assassins. And they actually did have plans, to carry out assassinations, even when the United States, right? So some of this stuff, it sounds like Hollywood thrillers when we're talking about like Project MK Ultra, for example, or Project Northwoods. It's the kind of stuff where unless you show people the actual documents, they still won't believe you. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, our government really did, train assassins, and they really did have plans to carry out assassinations within the United States. For example, to provide a pretext for the invasion of Cuba, for example. So there are good reasons why people have these kinds of suspicions. My own sense of it, though, is that, at the end of the day, as scandalous as these things are, and as much as we still need to learn, a lot of what they classify as top secret is actually not that interesting. I mean, to me, that's a whole other aspect of this.
Well, maybe the most interesting stuff is not left on a paper trail is part of it, probably, right? But there's a reason Trump just didn't release those additional JFK records when they were supposed to be calendar-wise released, right? What was that, 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah. Well, there are parts, of the government that will never agree to the release of anything that they call, sources and methods, right? So like to take an example, I think it's almost certainly the case, the National Security Agency was using all of its capabilities, to intercept communications and decode them. Certainly in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination. I'm sure the CIA was using all of its assets, as much as it could all around the world to learn more about it. They're not going to want to tell us, even about 1963, technology for decryption. They're not going to want to tell us about the identities of covert assets, even though it's 60 years later. They'll say things, for example, that, the fact that they were working for the United States is something that could still endanger their children or even their grandchildren, right? So there are things, I could well imagine that these agencies could, according to their own logic anyway, still want to keep secret all this time. And they're all also, and again, I'm going to push the boring part. Apparently, a lot of the redactions in these records, they're things like CIA file numbers. Like, right. Believe it or not, like for some reason, the CIA feels like their filing system is something where even if the individual numbers of individual files are disclosed, somehow it's going to blow up the United States. So sometimes, the kind of secrecy we're talking about, it could be very sinister, but sometimes it could be kind of banal.
Well, it's also just the paranoia that a bloated kind of militaristic empire engenders, right? Where we've gotten so large, so wealthy, so imperialistic in a modern sense that there becomes like an internal paranoia that you kind of that you see within some of these institutions. I would guess that trickles down. Mm-hmm. To some of the agents, workers there, and also just how bipartisan this is, this commitment to secrecy. You rightly point out that under the Obama administration, there were more prosecutions under the Espionage Act than in many more times over than in the previous administrations before it. I think, but a lot of us like liberals, me at the time, getting excited about Obama, people might not know that because that kind of secrecy and underhandedness is often associated with the Bush administration, but it's bipartisan here.
Yeah, well, Obama promised the most transparent administration in history, but under his watch, the number of times officials classified information reached an all-time high. It was 94 million times in 2012. That's 3 times every second, right? And like you said, like more people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaking information to journalists than all previous administrations combined. And so as much as presidents like come in, promising greater transparency and accountability, presidents find in secrecy a kind of sovereign power. They get to decide what the rest of us are allowed to know when they could say it's protected because of national security. And Congress and the courts have not provided any effective check on this otherwise unlimited power, right? And so when you use the word imperial, I think it's the right word because, what is empire but ruling over other people without having to answer to them, right? So, of course, this is even more the case, when the U.S. is running covert operations around the world, right? When we're carrying out a targeted killing program where hundreds, ultimately thousands of people are being killed under secret circumstances and according to president's secret orders. But, it matters also, when the American people aren't even allowed to know about the surveillance of the American public, because if the American people can't hold our leaders to account, then ultimately who can?
Yeah, it's undemocratic is really what it comes down to. The breadth of the holding of these kinds of secrets and what is determined to be secretive. Before I let you go, I just wanted to touch on how that connects to the Edward Snowden revelations, the continued attempts to extradite Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, etc. What do you think that crackdown on those that kind of attempt at transparency says about where we are right now, even in 2023, with government secrets?
Yeah. So, however you feel about Julian Assange, and WikiLeaks, if he is successfully prosecuted and imprisoned under the Espionage Act, for putting information out, that the United States government, deemed to be classified, then there are many, many other journalists, right, and activists who could also be prosecuted and imprisoned for doing the very same thing. So it's an incredibly important case. And it's not, coincidental that the Trump administration, made sure that among the things that he was being indicted for, made certain that it included the Espionage Act. Because there are people in government who would love to create this precedent. Never before has the Espionage Act been used to lock up journalists just for providing information, to the people. And so however you feel about Julian Assange, you really have to pay very close attention to what's going to happen in this case because the consequences could be incredibly important.
Actual last question, because I found it notable how you steer away from calling this information hole the deep state. You call it the dark state. That was intentional, I imagine, on your part to kind of reframe it. What was your reasoning behind that?
Yeah, it's because when people use the term the deep state, and this is certainly the case with Donald Trump and his supporters, what they're describing are people inside government accountable to no one who are carrying out machinations in defiance, of our elected leaders. I wish it was that simple. But unfortunately, the love of secrecy goes all the way to the top, right? So ultimately, like if presidents wanted to do something about this, they could. But every president, including Donald Trump, loves secrets, right? Trump is the only president who never issued an executive order to change our secrecy system, even a little. He was perfectly happy to continue using the same executive order that Obama used, right? So that's why I call it the dark state, because it's not just something that happens deep inside our government. It's something that's directed and permitted from the very highest levels. And it's also something that's covered up some of the darkest chapters in our history.
Matthew Connolly, professor of international and global history at Columbia University, author of The Declassification Engine, What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets. Thanks so much, Matthew. Really appreciate the conversation and your time today, and we'll put a link to your book in the description wherever you're listening or viewing this.
Thank you, Emma. Great to be with you.
Yeah, likewise. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Orly Noy. We are back, and we are joined now by Orly Noy, editor at Local Call, chair of B'Tselem, I hope I got that right, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and her latest piece in 972 magazine, which is a favorite of ours here, is called Do Israeli Protesters Really Want Democracy? Orly, thanks so much for coming on today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, where are you headquartered right now? Are you in Jerusalem?
I am.
Yes. So you're in the midst of these over a dozen week of protests in Israel. They've been temporarily successful for the aims that they've set out, right? Netanyahu has delayed his judicial overhaul after a ton of pressure. But I'm just fascinated because at issue, according to the protesters, is democracy, right?
Yeah.
But that democracy doesn't exist in Israel, right? So that's the problem I have with the framing. And I, from your piece, I feel like we have I can garner that you share that opinion.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, for so many years, Israelis were left to believe, both by their governments and also, it should be said, by the international community, that you can be considered as a democracy and maintain a brutal occupation, that you can be considered as a democracy and actually practice an apartheid regime. And so Israelis really didn't have any reason not to understand democracy in such a damaged way, that, you know, as far as it's functioning fine in protecting the basic rights of the Jewish citizens, then it's a perfect democratic country, and it's received as such by the international community. But no, you're absolutely right. Israel has not been a democracy for decades, and some would even argue it never was a real functioning democracy.
I mean, it can't be. It cannot. Let's just speak plainly, like a settler colonial government that excludes how many occupied or how many Palestinians, people living in the occupied territory, are unable to participate in the Israeli democracy?
Well, let's look at the entire territory, actually, between the river and the sea, the entire territory under the Israeli regime, including the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which are also being discriminated against under the same apartheid logic. And in that entire territory, the Jewish population is actually the minority. So we do have, I mean, we were surpassed already demographically by the Palestinians in the entire territory under Israeli regime. So you have a full-fledged apartheid regime, which is being implemented in different ways. I mean, the face of the Israeli apartheid is different in Gaza, and it's different in the West Bank, and it's different in East Jerusalem, and it's different in inside the 48 lines, inside the Green Line. But one thing they all have in common, and that is to maintain in every means possible the supremacy of Jews over their Palestinian neighbors. In all of that territory, in Gaza, there is no presence of Jewish settlers, but it's still sieged by the same apartheid rationale.
Well, the premise too, as well, of the protests in terms of making sure that the court system is not politicized to the degree that Netanyahu wants, is also a frustrating conceit from my perspective as well, because as we see in the West Bank, the escalation of the displacement of Palestinians from their ancestral homes, the seizure of that by settlers who, you know, the right-wing government of Israel is backing, there has been very little to no recourse by the court system for decades for Palestinians, because they say, oh, well, you know, you need a deed. Well, I don't have a deed. I've had this in my family for years. Well, too bad. Then it's this Israeli settler's home now. I mean, that is the system that this democracy is presiding over.
It's absolutely true. I mean, there is something incredibly worrying and alarming about the current attempt to completely empty the judicial system from any real substance. But at the same time, it should be mentioned that throughout the years, especially since 1967, but even before, towards the Israeli citizens, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, the Supreme Court gave little protection, very little protection to protect their rights, and actually legitimized every step that was taken by the Israeli establishment against Palestinians, the dispossession, the ethnic cleansing, the demolition of houses, the very, very frequent administrative detentions that can be renewed endlessly, and the court legitimized all that. The state-nation law, the citizenship law that actually prevents Palestinian citizens of Israel to marry spouses from the occupied territories and live together as a family unit. And the list goes on and on.
Yes. And that is the danger for me from the outside looking in of calling these pro-democracy protests. Because, as you say, that makes the actions before this attempt to take over the court system, like that puts them under the umbrella of democracy when in fact it is the exact opposite. And that's my fear, really, of some of the reaction to the protests internationally. I mean, Biden is condemning it, and he's going in a bit of a back and forth with Netanyahu. But the reality is that the United States is not going to cut its aid based on this. And even if it does, the incentive that creates is not to stop the apartheid. It's to maintain the existing court system, which already upholds the apartheid.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It is very, very unfortunate that the international community, headed by the United States, for such a long time gave Israel the green line to just, deepen, continue, not just maintaining, but deepening the occupation and the apartheid regime by calling it or presenting it as a symmetrical conflict that should be. It's not a conflict, and it's certainly not symmetrical. It's a brutal violation of the Palestinians' most basic rights. And, we are right now in Israel at a very significant moment, I think, that makes it possible, or requires, I think, to hold a conversation about the most basic fabrics of our socio-political life. Societies don't often get that chance. But right now we've been given a chance to really have an open conversation, a discourse about what it is, that democracy that we are calling out in the streets right now. What does it mean? Is it just a procedural democracy, just the envelope, the construction, or do we want to say something about the substance that fills that envelope? What is the substance of the democracy that we are demanding now? And this conversation, sadly enough, is not happening, or at least not happening enough in the Israeli society yet.
Yes. I mean, and I've been making this point for the past few weeks, talking about this. Fascism for thee and not for me is unsustainable. So now it turns on Israeli moderates, secular Jews within Israel, and but cutting out the ills that population faces insufficient. I mean, we saw this even with, and you write about this in your piece, the Balfour protests 3 years ago. Netanyahu getting ousted then. Well, now he's back in power. I mean, so that kind of shallow way of addressing the deep, deep undemocratic roots in this country right now is wildly insufficient.
Exactly, not just from a moral stand, but also from a strategic stand. Because what Balfour proved is that it's not enough to know what you do not want. You need to know what it is that you want and fight for that as well. Because what brought people together in the Balfour protest was knowing that they do not want Netanyahu. So fine, they got rid of Netanyahu, and we got the so-called government of change, where a very strange coalition that brought together Meretz from the Zionist left and hawkish right-wingers such as Bennett and Lieberman. And what we should remember is that government actually dissolved itself in order to protect the apartheid laws in the West Bank. So when we are looking at what's happening in the Israeli political sphere today, and if you listen to the Israeli discourse, you almost get a sense that some unidentified object from heaven just hit the wonderful Israeli democracy and shifted it from its course. That's not what happened. It was an inevitable outcome of a system that is built on notions of injustice and supremacy. And if we will not deal with those shortcomings today, we are bound to repeat and to go back to exactly where we are standing today.
Lastly, I mean, what's your sense of the composition of the protesters in the streets? I mean, record-breaking, millions, right? But then I see online, like anyone's carrying a Palestinian flag, it gets snatched from them. So I have no sense here in the United States what if there is some, like, what percentage of pro-Palestinian sentiment there is in the protest, but from the outside, it seems to return to like the tenor of our conversation today, which is just, it's wildly insufficient, that amount of representation in what we're talking about right now.
Absolutely. And even before we speak about the pro-Palestinians, we should ask, where are the Palestinians?
Yes.
Like, you don't see them. You don't see the Palestinian citizens, despite the fact that they are going to be the first and the most exposed communities to get hit and hurt by the reforms or the judicial coup that this government is promoting. So we really should ask ourselves, why is it that the Palestinian citizens do not come to these massive demonstrations? And the answer is very clear. It's because except for the anti-occupation bloc that you can find in the demonstrations, but they are quite small and quite restricted, the mass demonstrations are very militaristic in their terminology, are extremely nationalist in their practices. You all saw the masses, the seas of Israeli flags and the Declaration of Independence, and you can see it in the figures heading this protest, and the speakers. I don't think that there is a single ex-general left that has not spoken in those demonstrations yet. So maybe tactically, on the tactical level, it worked, and Netanyahu is not canceling anything, of course, he's just buying time. But on the strategic level, that type of protest just broadened the gap already existing between the Jewish and the Palestinian citizens, and without narrowing or closing that gap, a true struggle for a real democracy can never happen in Israel.
Orly Noy, editor at Local Call, chair of B'Tselem, is the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, and you can read her latest piece in 972 magazine, which we will put in the link below in the description of the podcast and the show here. Thank you so much, Orly. I really appreciate it. I am getting frustrated by seeing some of these like wide declarations of how important these protests are, when for me it's like we're talking about everything but what the actual issue is. And so that's my frustration.
And I completely share your frustration, and if I can just add one sentence,
sure.
To your audience, be active wherever you are. Put pressure on your representatives in the Senate, in the Congress. This is not helping the Israeli society, giving Israel the green light to go on with apartheid and occupation is not only immoral, it's not helping us, the Israeli society, either. And, there's a saying, friends don't let friends drive drunk. I think we have drunk people behind the wheel. So if you're a real friend, you will take the wheel from them.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you so much for your work within Israel as well, because I can't imagine what the pressure is like there to kind of cease with your efforts. So great appreciation. Thank you, Orly Noy. Have a good one.
Thank you very much.
All right, folks, with that, we're going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half. The number is 646-257-3920, 646-257-3920. We'll be taking your calls, reading your IMs. But first, check out Left Reckoning. Do you know, Bradley, who was on Left Reckoning on Tuesday?
I don't know if this was the most recent episode, but they did have Daniel Bessner on recently.
They did.
To discuss his piece on fascism in the New Republic.
Okay.
Well, and
you should always be checking out Left Reckoning.
Yeah, but
youtube.com/Left
Reckoning, patreon.com/Left Reckoning for the post game. Check it out there.
Yes. And for myself and Bradley, ESVN, we spoke at length about the Lamar Jackson contract negotiations. There are a lot of people who are saying like Lamar's taking some sort of stand with owners. I think that's misguided. And we break that down, as well as the anti-LGBTQ push within the NHL right now, naturally, why the World Baseball Classic is important to the sport. And hey, opening day today, baby. So baseball's hitting off today. Much to discuss over on youtube.com/ESVN show. With that, do we have Brandon and Binder soon? We have Brandon soon, but not on the screen quite yet. I'll read some IMs here. Isaac Mayon Cox said, okay. Wait till you hear the IM. Having a bad hair day, Emma? I mean, man, you are just whoever you are. What a gem you are. Thank you. And I did not think I was having a bad hair day until I looked a little bit of strays. A few strays. It's all good, though. How you doing, Brandon?
I'm a lot better now.
Yeah, right? I fixed it. What's up? How are you?
Well, I'm having a great hair day. I love my whole like thing that I have going on. I'm going to get it cut soon, but I love the like anarchy that the curls represent.
Right. You just never know which way it's going to go on a given day. It's like it provides spice for your life, right?
I have a lot of fun playing with my own hair. Like we, as a people, we can't allow white people to do it, but generally speaking, I'll just sit here and just like pat it all day.
I mean, you're teasing those white people then.
Just by being alive, yeah.
Right. See what I can do and you can't do. What's happening over on the discourse?
Besides touching our hair and saying the N-word, lots of stuff. We should have we should have a lot of stuff going on this weekend. Had a few big personal things in the cooking that panned out, so now we have a lot more time to record, and I hope to re-injuvenate our fans with a level of content that they are, I'm gonna be honest with you, not prepared for.
Okay, gotcha.
That was vague, but yeah, we'll have an episode out this weekend.
Check out the discourse. People are saying that there's an echo with Brandon's mic, so we're fixing it. Okay, there we go. It's fixed.
Hello?
Hello?
Can you hear me? I don't hear an echo, so.
Sounds good to me, but Bradley says it's fixed, so we are, I think we're good. All good? All right, we don't have Binder yet, but we gotta head into the fun half and we'll see him there. Check out Doomed, check out Scam Economy. Again, the number is 646-257-3920. See you there, bye-bye.
You are in for it. All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Anarchy. Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just wanna degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it to my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman!
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ Danner.
Yeah, or a couple of them, just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. You see white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males.
Psych. Fuck them.
Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. All lives matter.
Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy!
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
Back. Not quite yet with Matt Binder, but soon enough. He's having some tech issues. Let's hope he can get that figured out. Here, let me just give myself a little more headroom. Bingo bango. God, I'm becoming Sam. Anyway,